afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to everyone here in the audience who's braved another snowy February day to get here, and thank you to all of you who are online with us for the live stream. I'm Daniel Jocelyn Simitowski. I am the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here at Boston College, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to our lecture today with Matilda Tomaryn Bruckner. So please let me introduce her. Dr. Bruckner is Professor Emerita of French here at Boston College. She's published numerous books and articles on 12th and 13th century Romance and lyric, and Old French and Occitan, including such books as Shaping Romance, Interpreting Truth and Closure in 12th century French fictions. Her research and publications also include animal studies, narrative in verse and prose, and most recently a turn to Jewish-Christian relations in the Bible in her most recent book that we'll hear about today, Jewish-Christian Dialogue in Medieval French Literature, Inscribing Biblical Encounters in the Vernacular. Her book is available by Boydell Brewer. We have flyers in the back with a discount code, which is always useful. And there'll also be a link placed in the Zoom chat with that information as well. It's a real pleasure to mark the publication of Matilda's newest book today. As you all know, she's been a significant part of the Boston College community and a real friend and supporter of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning since its inception. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruckner.
Thank you, Dan, and all the brave people who have come today to attend in person, and welcome as well to all the people on Zoom. I think that to the two certainties of death and taxes, we can now add this year, it's February. If you're scheduled to give a talk, it's going to snow. But I'm glad to be here. And as a medievalist, I am used to talking to the happy few, so welcome. So let me dive right in. Since this is a talk about biblical encounters, I'm taking my cue from the Bible. To start by explaining its genesis. You might say I backed into this project as much by chance as by design. In my previous book, I analyzed the enigmatic character of the first Grail romance, Chrétien de Troyes' Conte du Graal. Its many puzzles include the mysteries of the eponymous Grail, which in this romance is a deep, wide dish carried in procession with a bleeding lance. The status of two contrasting but intertwined heroes, Percival, a naive adolescent, and Arthur's nephew Gawain, the consummate knight. The unprecedented mix of religion and Arthurian matter in a story considerably longer than Chrétien's 4 previous romances, yet still unfinished. The list goes on and on. In the manuscript tradition, 4 continuations offer more adventures, narrative serving as commentary on the questions explicitly and implicitly inscribed in Chrétien's story of the Grail. I argued that the dialogue between the mother text and successive expansions resembled Jewish midrash, rabbinical stories invented to explain contradictions or fill in gaps in the biblical text. That insight suggested further work on the Grail romances and biblical exegesis might be fruitful. As 12th century exegetes in both Jewish and Christian traditions began to focus on the Bible's literal and historical sense, reading in a way that we would describe as literary, so Chrétien moved toward exegesis by introducing religious discourse into romance narrative, well attuned to the literal. Though we know nothing about Chrétien beyond what we can learn from his works, some medievalists have speculated that this inventor of Arthurian romance might have been influenced by the new turn to the literal in biblical exegesis. I wanted to find out what that might mean. In the meantime, invited to participate in Richard Carney's graduate seminar on hospitality in the 5 faith traditions, I encountered Vienna 2554, an early 13th century manuscript of a moralized Bible. Richard asked me to respond to the art historian Pamela Berger, and she decided to focus on 2554's representation of Judges 19, a story of hospitality gone seriously awry. In an episode that recalls the attack against Lot's angelic visitors in Genesis, hosting quarrels arise in Judges when men come to claim a deacon, the French equivalent to the Bible's Levite, a guest under his host's protection. The assailants take the deacon's wife when he pushes her out the door. Raped all night, she dies the next morning on the host's threshold. Seeking revenge against the perpetrators, the deacon chops her corpse into pieces to send out as messages, and bloody battle ensues. This tale of rape, mutilation, and vengeance was interpreted in the first 2 moralized Bibles as the Church Fathers' efforts to reclaim pagan philosophy, an allegory that refers to contemporary debate at the University of Paris over the reception of certain Aristotelian writings. At first horrified, I was soon fascinated, and this serendipitous return to issues of interpretation and translation from another angle led me to embark on a new book as I headed into retirement. With chapters on Chrétien's Percival and the Bible moralisée claiming the beginning and end, I chose a variety of vernacular works for the middle chapters that would offer a further glimpse into the different ways biblical material appears in Old French in the 12th and 13th centuries. With a group of 4 bestiaries translated from Latin, I studied how Bible verses introduce Christian commentaries on classical animal lore, layering literal and figurative meanings together. In the Jeu d'Adam, dramatizing Adam and Eve's creation and fall, followed by Cain's murder of his brother, I focused on the play's idiosyncratic 3rd act, when a procession of prophets who announce the coming of Christ is interrupted by a debate staged between Isaiah and Quidam de Synagoga, someone from the synagogue. For all these Christian writers, the Hebrew Bible is the Old Testament seen from the New. The Church's codex dominates the Jews' drooping scroll, as we can see repeatedly in the Bible moralisée. Overall, my 5 chapters move from works that use biblical matter in different shapes and forms, its content varied and various, to Scripture itself, a Bible translated, or better, transposed and interpreted from Genesis to Kings. Each work connects Bible time and current time, and Jews provide one of the best ways to make that connection, not only through the words of the Bible, but in relation to contemporary people, Jews in the neighborhood, rabbis consulted by Christian biblical scholars, or merchants supplying the needs of townspeople, counts, and clerics. As Mary Rubin has noted, Jews were useful to think with. Reaching through the figurative encounters generated by these texts, I tried to make contact with people caught in the throes of history. But as a literary scholar, I studied most especially their representation in writing, performance, and images, Jews invented by Christians, as the identity and claims of 2 faith communities were defined and disputed around the treatment of their shared sacred text. In Augustine's view, influential throughout the Middle Ages, Jews testified to the Bible's ancient truth, but superseded by the true Israel, they carried the guilt of the crucifixion and had to be degraded. Encountering the biblical in vernacular works leads inevitably to Jewish-Christian polemics. Let me explain a bit more that exegetical turn to the literal, since one of the distinctive features of biblical encounters is my attention to what I call the play of the letter. First, remember that the Bible is a collection of books. Its medieval presentation was often selective, incomplete, open to additions through commentary, compilation, and so on. The lay public acquired knowledge of biblical material through liturgy and preaching, stained glass windows, devotional sculptures, translations, and dramatizations. Peering through the lens offered by vernacular works, we can get a glimpse of how they reacted to Scripture. The Bible showcases not only the power of stories, their capacity to move through time and space, religions and cultures, but the power in stories. Witness their contested interpretations. Jewish rabbis and Christian scholars shared a common desire to move the biblical text toward the experience of contemporary readers and what they could understand in terms of their own lives. The new attention to the Bible's literal and historical sense starts east of Paris in Troyes with Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, known as Rashi, and his grandsons, Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam, who were Chrétien's contemporaries. And it takes off among Christians with Hugh, the undisputed master of the Victorines, and his followers, Richard and Andrew, located on the left bank of the Seine, just outside Paris, at the Abbey of Saint Victor, a short walk from the synagogue and Notre Dame. Proximity and shared affinities attest to mutual dialogues, as both schools demonstrated a new focus on the human authors who shaped the Bible's words. And both used similar methods, including textual analysis and Hebrew philology, to verify the correctness of their texts and translations as they studied the unique character of biblical language and the chronology of its unfolding events. With these shifts in emphasis, exegetes loosened their link to traditional spiritual interpretations and opened the way for new ones, as textual, linguistic, and historical issues fueled growing attention to the letter and its literal sense. So contemporary Jewish and Christian usage overlaps, but only partially, as each tradition defines and redefines the borders of the literal in relation to figurative meaning. The Christian scholar's literal sense, like the rabbi's pshat or plain sense, seems to imply what's most simple and straightforward, the primary sense of the letter, or exact words of the text. But where the literal level ends and the spiritual begins, how plain sense relates to midrash, these are major questions I examined in the book, since these terms and concepts were used differently in the past from the way they're used today. The literal level has depth for medieval exegetes. It contains layers, includes metaphor, as we can see in Hugh's three-part understanding of litera, sensus, and sententia, or with Rashi's pursuit of whole meaning, which sometimes led him to include selected midrash, which he rewrote in his plain sense commentary in order to grasp the full potential of biblical writing. I found his model particularly useful for analyzing Chrétien's romance, since it's at the level of process, strategies, and concepts, modus operandi, what and how to interpret, rather than content per se, that we can most fruitfully follow a potential dialogue between the Bible, exegesis, and Chrétien's Grail story. My introduction and first chapter include a synthesis of scholarly research on 12th century exegesis, definitions of the literal, its historical and chronological aspects, the role of narrative order and sequence, the importance of language and context, the shifting relationships between different levels of interpretation. This groundwork operates throughout biblical encounters as literal and spiritual senses are renegotiated by literary traditions and genres, individual works, and particular passages. But other issues emerge as well. As I study how biblical quotation, polemics, and demands for conversion resurface in different texts. Successive chapters connect with each other over claims to authority and ownership of the Bible, definitions of self and other, charges of Judaizing, and expressions of religious belief, doubt, anxiety, and fears. Throughout the book, I focus on how reading involves interpretation, both now and then. In the medieval context, reading often takes the form of listening. It's not passive. And given the topics I'm dealing with, it easily becomes an area of debate and dispute. Of course, you also need to know how I read. How do I define my approach? In the broadest sense, I keep my eyes and ears open and curious. I pay attention to the way texts are put together, how they work, what effects or reactions they seek or create, whether in the cognitive domain, how does this mean, what does this mean, or the affective, what emotions does this elicit, what associations. Close reading, a major tool to focus in, is complemented by focusing out, textual analysis informed by expectations associated with particular literary types and genres, enriched by historical context, as well as theoretical currents in contemporary criticism. To guide my analyses, I take a multidisciplinary approach that learns from biblical scholarship, social and intellectual history, art history, Jewish studies, codicology, performance arts, and so on. In addition to information and analytic tools, I need the resources of imagination to read these works. As one of Chrétien's characters demands, echoing Jesus in the book of Matthew, I need to listen to them not only with my ears, but with my heart, the seat of medieval emotion, memory, courage. So I try to encounter these works with a kind of double vision, seeking to be as true as possible to their time and place. I locate them in their medieval context, even if we can never put ourselves back in the minds and hearts of medieval people. But I also read them from and for the present to show why they're still worth reading today. What can they teach us about the past as we view it from today's perspective? And just as important, what can they teach us about the present? Hence, the need for both scholarship and imagination to cross the gaps of time and experience. Paradoxical tensions pull Jews and Christians toward each other and push them apart. In the 12th and 13th centuries, that ambivalence stretches from productive scholarly exchanges over the Bible, its text and interpretations, to harsh rejection as anti-Judaism mingles across the centuries with anti-Semitism. Biblical Encounters isn't a book about anti-Semitism per se, but as that issue has become so dominant in current discourse and experience, I felt the need to end my book not with a conclusion, but with an epilogue to emphasize how different positions were historically possible, even within the parameters of a generally hostile climate for Jews and Judaism in medieval Christian societies. When Christians talk to or about Jews through the Bible they both profess, what is said requires careful assessment to unveil possible meanings. Biblical citation can serve as an expression of belief, a tool of persuasion, or a weapon of aggression. How you read the Bible's words matters. So take a little tour with me as I point out significant nuances in the encounters represented in my corpus. Chrétien opens the Conte du Graal with a variation on the parable of the sower and quotations from the New Testament in order to praise his patron, Philip of Flanders, who refuses to listen to ugly mockery and outrageous speech. Why does the gospel say, "Hide the good things from your left hand"? The left, according to the source, signifies vainglory, which comes from false hypocrisy. And the right, what does it signify? Charity, which does not brag about its good work, but rather conceals it so that no one knows of it except God, whose name is charity. So begins a meditation that lies at the heart of Chrétien's Grail story. How does speech, good and bad, invite or inhibit violence in a society rife with bloodshed? Well into the narrative, on a Good Friday, Percival encounters a penitent knight. The credo he professes vilifies Jews as Christ killers. They should be killed like dogs, he says. Today, we would label his diatribe hate speech. But already, in the context of a romance that stigmatizes vicious words that incite, indeed perform violence, his invective reverberates against the romance's critique of villainous speech. The dissonance suggests we should mistrust religious words used to summon violence. 10 years earlier, in 1171, Chrétien's contemporaries witnessed such violence when the Count of Blois, following an accusation without a body to substantiate it, ordered 31 Jews, men and women, burned to death. Burned for killing a Christian boy that didn't exist. Among those who tried to stop the unfounded massacre was the Count's brother, Henry the Liberal, Count of Champagne. We know that his court at Troyes enjoyed romances since his wife Marie commissioned Chrétien's Lancelot. Rashi's grandson, Rabbi Jacob Thom, who enjoyed professional as well as friendly relations with Henry, coordinated Jewish efforts to avoid the massacre. At Philip of Flanders' court, as at Henry the Liberal's, sophisticated listeners accustomed to the ironies inscribed in Chrétien's romances might have justly measured the difference between Percival's mother teaching him the credo and a knight turning it into a murderous invitation. Wolfgang von Eschenbach's German translation illustrates that potential, even if many authors who rewrote the Grail story missed or dismissed Chrétien's subtle subversions. In the unfinished story of the Grail, where the romancer seems to experiment with new ways of thickening the literal level to give romance greater metaphorical reach, his resistance to the closure of ending and fixed interpretation seems to me to embody resistance to the dangerous potential of religious discourse. Of course, the Passion story often attracts virulent anti-Judaism, as we see in French bestiaries as well. In the interplay between animal characteristics and allegorical glosses aligning animal nature and human nature, Jews are equated with darkness, like birds of the night. Like wild asses, they become figures of the devil. Like hyenas, they switch between sexes and eat corpses. I argued that the bestiary's anti-Judaism exceeds the negative charge of individual animals and needs to be understood as a pattern embedded in its use of Old and New Testament quotations. A good example is provided by the chapter on the many-colored panther, interpreted allegorically as Christ the Savior. In Pierre de Beauvai's version, a dense concentration of biblical verses mirrors the rhythm of exegesis with multiple proof texts that interpret the panther's nature, highlighted in a passage on the crucifixion and resurrection filled with anti-Jewish hostility. A quotation from Hosea, "I am like the panther," motivates the expanded exposition and commentary. But that panther isn't in the Hebrew Bible or in the Vulgate, Jerome's Latin translation. To find it, I had to go back to the Septuagint. the earliest Greek translation, where God warns that he will punish his unfaithful people. Like a panther and a lion, he will tear them to pieces. Physiologus, the anonymous second century Greek model for the medieval bestiary, reversed the panther's ferocious image, not only in the Greek Bible, but in classical scientific lore, where the big cat ambushes and devours other animals. Why the reversal? I proposed that the panther became a figure of Christ to counter contemporary Jewish rumors that Jesus was the son of a whore and a Roman soldier named Ben Pantera, son of the panther. If you saw Monty Python's Life of Brian about a mistakenly identified Messiah, you caught a whiff of those tales. They appear in the Talmud and eventually take shape as Toldot Yeshu, a life of Jesus that trickled through the centuries in both Christian and Jewish circles. Discredited by his illegitimate birth, Jesus steals the ineffable name, acquires magic powers in Egypt, dies by hanging as a renegade Jew, and is secretly buried by a gardener. In the afterlife, he boils in excrement in hell. Not pretty. But Toldot Yeshu is a sophisticated counter-narrative that aims to debunk the gospel accounts, especially John's, the most anti-Jewish version. Jews, too, participate in polemics. Bestiaries generally address Christians, but Pierre de Beauvais, like Physiologus, occasionally speaks to Jews, calling them to baptism, castigating to proselytize. They layer together the negative Jew, blind to their scripture's meaning, and the potential new Christian, if a stiff-necked donkey can be made to see the light. When Solomon and Daniel, how that might play out is suggested in the Jeu d'Adam's procession of prophets. When Solomon and Daniel speak directly to Jews as, quote, felons against God who lose their unction when the anointed one gives life to his people, this is supersessionism at its most pointed. Christianity's claim to be the true Israel separates biblical Hebrews from unbelieving Jews living now, as the Bible moralised demonstrates with ruthless antagonism. But the play's Jeremiah points to the church door, open to welcome the good Judah's line. The invitation introduces a drama of conversion that interrupts Isaiah's prophecy of the flowering rod. Someone from the synagogue enters, disputing. The verb signals the tradition of Jewish Christian literary disputations, prominent in the 12th and 13th centuries. These debates focused on key passages from the Old and New Testaments, whose interpretation was contested through literal and spiritual readings. The dialogue between Isaiah and the Jew transforms the stately formality of the Ordo Prophetarum into a lively contest and reveals that the Hebrew prophets are speaking for both sides of the dispute, proving that the Christian truth has already been written and recognized by the other. Although literary disputations rarely led to conversions, here we could quickly arrive at a triumphant end when the Jew promises that he and his whole generation will convert. How did the prophet convince him? Not by biblical words, not by reasoning and textual interpretation, but rather by sleight of hand, quite literally. Isaiah reads sickness and death inscribed by error on the Jew's palm and promises him cure and salvation only through Christian belief. I ended up devoting 2 chapters to the Vienna 2554 in order to delve into the anti-Jewish punch of its texts and illustrations. While Bible moralised are usually studied in the context of art history, intellectual or social history, I offered a new evaluation by placing it in the company of literary texts to show how it engages all the issues raised in previous chapters, even as it adds new dimensions to biblical encounters. Jews are never mentioned in the commentary on Judges 19, despite their frequent appearance elsewhere in the manuscript. But as Sarah Lipton's Images of Intolerance has shown, they constantly lurk in the way unbelievers and heretics are represented as vicious thugs, clutching money bags, and little devils, wearing pointy hats and Phrygian caps, distinctive clothing required by church councils to distinguish Jews from Christians. I suggest that the ostensible absence of Jews from the hospitality sequence aims to conceal, at least momentarily, the foundational conflict between Hebrew scriptures and Christian testaments. How so? In 2554, the men who violate the laws of hospitality and gang rape the deacon's wife are identified as sodomites. On the allegorical level, they have grabbed pagan philosophy away from the protection of the church fathers, Augustine and Jerome. Through the narrative and gloss, we can glimpse a struggle for power and position within the University of Paris between secular arts masters and the mendicants, Franciscans, and Dominicans. On the manuscript page, it takes 3 battles to avenge the wife's death, as sodomites resist but finally capitulate to the victorious Israelites, and pagan philosophy returns to safety in the hands of the church fathers. But sodomites versus Israelites opens a serious gap between the Bible and this moralized version. The Hebrew Tanakh and the Latin Vulgate describe an intertribal conflict among brothers. 11 tribes are allied against the 12th to avenge the shame caused by the Ephraimites. In 2554, exegesis has preceded and determined biblical representation. The transpositions between Bible narrative and French paraphrase played out in texts and images are manipulated. The clear-cut division in the layout of each folio's alternating levels undermined. The producers of the manuscript have changed the biblical letter to conform to the reforms of clergy and laity they seek, in this case, restoring Christian safeguards to the reception of Aristotle's works and protecting the sacraments against their rejection by heretics. As I argue, Judges 19 ultimately reveals the conflict between Hebrew scriptures and Christian testaments as the underlying issue, masked and unmasked by Christianity's reclaiming of pagan philosophy. It covers over and yet points to, indirectly, the violence of Christianity's more foundational appropriation and dissection of the Hebrew Bible, seen through the anxieties caused by absorption into Christian thought of Aristotle's natural, metaphysical, and ethical writings. Read as a figurative unveiling, this sequence thus offers a synecdoche and metaphor for the entire project of the Bible moralisée. Over and over again, the intimate relation between Judaism and Christianity, 2 religions we now recognize as siblings born from the Hebrew Bible, is reclassified as replacement, the old law superseded by the new. Words can kill or save, confess a faith or call for conversion. Borrowing biblical speech to voice disputed claims of authority, ownership, and meaning, these Christian works embed their Jews in intricate textual worlds. How did medieval readers react? That may be as varied and difficult to pin down as current debates about the definitions and applications of anti-Judaism, antisemitism, Judeophobia, hate speech. Although no single word can catch all the complexities that medieval texts and historical events reveal across time and space, I use the term anti-Judaism since it highlights the religious base of the antagonism, not only against the Jewish faith, but against the people who profess and practice it, the synagogue, as seen by Christian authors. In her chapter on Jews in Idols of the East, Suzanne Conklin-Akbari discusses, whoops, I'm ahead of myself. Oh no, I'm behind myself. Sorry. Suzanne Conklin-Akbari discusses how difficult it is to determine the relationship between anti-Judaism, the earlier theological discourse, and the later scientific discourse of anti-Semitism, formulated in the 19th century. Anti-Semitism invokes blood and inheritance, and thus calls to issues of race and racism. As Akbari states, these two discourses do not remain separate. Instead, one reinforces the other. And just as anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism remain entangled, current efforts to differentiate anti-Semitism from anti-Zionism remain trapped in controversy, intertwined and weaponized by political polarization. The university quarrels represented in the Bible moralisée have their counterpart today. In my study of biblical encounters, respecting the specificities of historical, religious, cultural, and history and literary contexts was my goal and guiding principle, along with confidence in the fruitfulness of a meeting between past and present. In each chapter, I tried to allow continuities as well as differences to emerge through the variety of works examined and the wide gamut of encounters represented: experience, relationship, exchange, opposition, contestation, polemics. In the longue durée of the Middle Ages, questions focused on Jews and Judaism are as diverse and mixed as today's efforts to identify or refute anti-Semitic words and actions. Appreciation of complexity and avoidance of reductive simplifications, a sense of historical depth, all are crucial for these discussions. Gradations of antagonism and cooperation are visible across time and geography as Jews and Christians interacted in their daily lives and in the biblical encounters included in my corpus. The Center for Christian Jewish Learning sponsored a conference here in 2023 entitled Shared Scripture, Divided Faiths, the Medieval Jewish Christian Encounter over the Hebrew Bible/Old Testament. The dialogue among papers, and especially Hans von Lehrer's keynote speech on Hebraeus and Judaeus, Hebrew and Jew, two words encapsulating 1,000 years of Christian ambivalence, demonstrated that in different places at different times, across good times and bad, the push and pull of Christian-Jewish relations can shift, change, and difference are possible. While I focused on the myriad ways vernacular writing reshaped biblical material in the past, I hope that Biblical Encounters also furnishes a context for better understanding contemporary concerns as we confront the rise of anti-Semitism and the need for interfaith dialogue in the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matilda, for that talk. It's on now. Thank you very much for that. Very, very engaging, really illuminating in a lot of ways. We're going to open up the floor to questions, conversation. One of the things I would just want to say to kick things off is I found it really useful for me, coming from the discipline of theology, to just really underline the ways in which theological reasoning, scriptural debates are so easily transmitted in multiple cultural modalities. It seems even at the same time, it's not really a gap, it seems like, between when the theoretical ideas are explored and the literary cultural production is being created. Can you say just a little bit more about that transfer across different modes of culture?
Sure. I think in my own career, I have seen a shift from times when literary people divided between study of secular literature and the religious stuff was over there. I mean, I taught the Vie de Saint Alexis, but essentially the work I did focused on romance and lyrics, so I could safely hide myself from some of the nastier bits of medieval culture. But people's lived experiences, of course, so radically different. And I think today, even literary scholars, as well as people in other disciplines, realize that although it's sometimes useful and necessary to make borders and focus in here and there, it's also just as necessary to cross those borders that we erect and to realize that all these things are connected, that there is, you cannot talk about works without encountering a wide gamut of human experience, and that includes religion as well as other aspects of aristocratic life, in particular in the kinds of texts that I generally have been dealing with.
Thank you. So the floor is open for more questions. Just please wait until the mic gets to you.
Thank you so much, Matilda, for your wonderful work. And I know that your earlier work has been on romance of this era, the 12th century. And what I'm wondering about is if we could bring the two together somehow. And part of this is because when we look at some of the images or hear you speak about some of the ways in which Jews are depicted, we recoil. It's awful, it's terrible. But I'm wondering if in the context of the 12th century, and whether you want to still go with Chenu and call it a Renaissance, but in that context, would the depictions, the negative depictions somehow be enticing, attractive, romantic, and evoke a different kind of feeling than the feeling that we have today when we look at those images? What do you think they're evoking in that romantic context?
So, first of all, in romance, until you get to Chrétien, Jews have no place. His 4 previous romances have nothing. Religion is the furniture in the world in which they operate, Christian religion, but otherwise, but once you get to Grail romances, then there's plenty of atmosphere that includes Jews, and generally they are not positively represented in Grail romances, except in Chrétien and in Wolfram. If you look at the images that I've shown you, the cover of my book comes from the beginning of the hospitality sequence. Although I have to say, miraculously, as I studied my cover for this talk, I realized that on the manuscript pages, there are 4 levels. There's a level of narrative from the Bible, and then there's a level of interpretation of that. Then there's another level of narrative from the Bible, and then another layer of interpretation of that, at least in the layout of this particular quite exceptional Bible moralisée. Somehow the person who designed my cover miraculously left out the 3rd level and jumped down to the 4th. And yet you can't see that there's any gap in the representation on the cover. So I have to say, in terms of attraction, for example, that you mentioned, Susanna, these images are spectacularly beautiful. They're just totally engrossing. You can't get enough of them looking at them. And of course, I also tried to show you that if you look closely enough, the images of Jews, in this particular, I'm not showing you images of Jews because this is from Judges 19, and there are no Jews. But as I said, if you look at those faces, those are not attractive faces. Those are repulsive, long-nosed, vicious-looking, evil faces. And that is what Sarah Lipton, who's an art historian, has shown is all over this beautiful Bible moralisée. So there's both, incredible beauty and attraction in this book, and at the same time there is a kind of underlying drumbeat of pushing away, making ugly, making unhuman almost.
Matilda, thank you so much for this presentation. You really made us, well, at least me, want to read the book. I was wondering, in the beginning of your talk, I found very interesting your explanation of your methodology for working with this and how this literal turn in the beginning, in exegesis, is kind of, well, if I understood correctly, it's fundamental for the encounters that you were observing. Can you explain a little bit more of that? I don't study a lot exegesis, and I'd like to understand a little bit better what this literal turn is and what it means for the text that you've chosen to work on.
So I am not a biblical scholar, I will say up front, and what I had to do in the process of writing this book was learn about biblical exegesis and learn from people who were really immersed and well-versed in both Christian and Jewish traditions in that respect. Aside from the suggestion of several scholars about bringing together the Conte du Graal, Chrétien's romance, and this exegetical turn to the literal, I am the one who invents this rapprochement for the other chapters of this book. I'm the one who has decided that, well, you know, if there's something there in what people have suggested about Chrétien's Grail romance, then what might that something be? And so I tried to understand. There had been very little work actually on the question, although the possibility had been raised. And there was a very good article by a medievalist in English, Michael Sturgis, who talked about a kind of indeterminism, which for him qualified for representing what that turn to the literal might mean. Otherwise, having worked on Chrétien's, having spent a considerable amount of time beginning to learn myself about biblical exegesis and then seeing how that might help me to read the Conte du Graal, and realizing that, again, if I'm talking about biblical material, it's not always the content per se, but rather a way of proceeding to use that material or to use other material. I mean, in the chapter on Chrétien's Grail romance, I zigzagged back and forth between aspects of this turn to the literal in biblical exegesis and what facets that made biblical scholars focus on. I gave you a short list, but things like narrative and sequence, which we recognize as literary scholars as exactly the kind of thing that we look at. And that's what these biblical scholars in both traditions are beginning to do. And so, but they also talked about the importance of history as part of the literal level. And so one of the aspects of Chrétien's work, for example, in romance was the idea that he basically took off from some historical writing of the 11th and 12th century about King Arthur and so forth, but he extracted that from history and placed all of his adventures, these knightly quests and adventures, in a kind of suspended moment, a pax romana, pax arthuriana, a kind of moment when history didn't count, it didn't move forward, and so we could go off on adventure. But what I argued in reading the Grail romance is that, in fact, he reintroduces history. And where does he get that? Well, I don't know if he got it. I can't make any claim. We don't know who Chrétien was. There have been speculations that he was a converted Jew or his parents. I don't go down that route, but I say these are people who were in the same time and place, just as we know, I haven't read books about physics, as some of my colleagues here and friends, but I know something about physics because it's in the air, and so maybe Chrétien knew something about this. Obviously, he trained in a Christian Latin framework, and so I wanted to say, well, if I think about those things together in my mind and see if that means anything in terms of these works, then without claiming cause and effect, I can at least show that I see something in Chrétien's romance that I wouldn't otherwise have noticed if I hadn't been thinking along the lines of biblical exegesis. And that's essentially then what I did in the other chapters as well. Realizing that the procession of prophets in the Jeu d'Adam has been turned into a debate, a disputation. No one else has talked about that, but it seemed clear to me once I thought along those lines that I'm seeing something that people haven't noticed before, and that it's worthwhile seeing that something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's made it very clear, and I agree with you. And the question of the dispute in the university seems to be very clearly implied in the passage of the Bible. Thank you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, perhaps.
Hi, Matilda. Thank you so much. I'm wondering what the relationship is between the illuminations and the text. I mean, obviously the text comes before the illuminations, but did Chrétien have anything to do with how it became illuminated?
Very few of Chrétien's romances are illustrated. I showed you some nice pictures all the way through because they're always fun and beautiful to see, but it's only in the chapter on the Bible moralisée where I talk about the relationship between images and text, because in the Bible moralisée, you mostly have images and you have tiny little bits of text down the two columns. In other papers and times, I have talked about the relationship between certain kinds of romance images. Later in the prose romances in particular, there's a lot of illustration. But Chrétien's romances don't depend on images, the way the Bible moralisée obviously depends primarily. The image comes first, and then the text gets added, according to people who have studied the manuscripts. In the bestiaries, they are frequently illustrated, and there's a lot to be said of interest. I've talked about it in other contexts about the relationship between the images and the texts. And I tried to show you, at least with the panther, that there's many different takes on what panthers look like and how many colors. The whole issue of what animal that really is one of a major discussion in my chapter, because it's not always clear what a panther is. And so there, again, I could have worked on that aspect, but I didn't do that in this book. For the Procession of Prophets, I showed you an illustration from a cathedral in Spain. There are on various cathedrals sculptural groups that represent the prophets in that way. And so there too, I know a colleague who has been working on that, but that's not the route I took in this case.
Good. I just have to say in conclusion, I just really marvel the way you've put together these different cultural productions in the same period of time. And I think it's just really a groundbreaking work that you've done here. I hope you get much more reviews and attention and feedback on this. And so please join me all in thanking Matilda for her talk today.
Thank you.